Well, good afternoon again, everyone. And today I want to talk about something that's very dear to my heart as a pilot, and that is the first operational aircraft that I ever flew, the Lightning. Probably the main reason why I joined the Royal Air Force, because I had seen an advert for the Royal Air Force which said, join the Royal Air Force and the world is your oyster. And on the front page of this brochure, there was a Squadron of Lightnings lined up. I think it was at Caldershall in Norfolk, and the pilots were walking back from the sortie, clearly sort of in animated discussion. And I looked at that and I said, that is me. And from that moment onwards, I was single-mindedly focused on flying the Lightning. It was my aim, and I'm pleased to report that it was an aim that I achieved. So I'm not going to talk about my training. Suffice to say sort of that you can't just sort of choose an aircraft and go and fly it. You've got to earn the right to go and fly it. And I worked very hard going through the training system. I was totally focused on becoming a Lightning pilot, becoming a fighter pilot as well, because my father had been a fighter pilot in the war, flying Hurricanes. And fortunately I took to flying like a duck to water. By hard work, and obviously I had a bit of ability, I presume, I was rewarded by being posted to my dream aircraft, the Lightning. First time I saw the Lightning was in 1967, when I went to RAF Caldershall again to do my conversion. And I remember standing next to it and thinking, wow, it just took my breath away. It was so big. I thought, this is a big aircraft, and it is a big aircraft, all 20 tons of it. But I think what I'm going to talk about, my own experiences flying the Lightning, but I'll talk about the aircraft first of all. The aircraft it first flew in about 1950, in the mid-1950s, mid to late 1950s, and I think it entered RAF service mainly in about 1961 or so. So I was 6 years down. I was what they call a first tourist. I know still to this day the three chaps who were the very first tourists. Actually, there's only two of them left now, because one of them went to the Red Arrows and was killed in an accident, unfortunately. But they're still very good friends of mine. I was sometime afterwards, but I was a first tourist. I was a very lucky boy. You know, I came from South Africa, in fact, and people always say to me, well, why didn't you join the South African Air Force? Well, I didn't join the South African Air Force for several reasons. One, because my father was a battle pilot and been in the RAF. Two, because I always thought the Royal Air Force was the best air force in the world. Three, because I felt that the South African Air Force, I didn't speak much Afrikaans, in fact, and I would have had to know much more Afrikaans than I did. But the main reason, quite frankly, was because I wanted to fly the Lightning. He said, well, you can fly the Mirage in the South African Air Force. I said, yes, I probably could. But in those days, you were unlikely to get your hands on a Mirage until you were into your late 30s. And I couldn't wait that long, whereas I knew that I could join the RAF, I could be selected straight from training to go and fly the Lightning, which is what I did. When I first flew the Lightning, I was 22 years old. The aircraft itself, the first supersonic fighter that the RAF ever had, it's a big aircraft. It's got two very powerful Rolls-Royce Avon engines, producing varying amounts of power depending on which sort of engines you're flying with. There were several Avon engines in different marks of Lightning. There were different marks of Lightning. I flew both the what I call the short-range Lightning. These were aircraft that had underneath the belly of the aircraft what we call a ventral tank, a small ventral tank, and the range of that aircraft and the sortie duration was quite short. To the bigger Lightnings, where they had a much bigger ventral underneath the aircraft, which I did fly as well, and they had a significantly increased range and duration and sortie duration. So the aircraft, two big engines, and they were reheats. We had a reheat capability as well. So cold power, you could select reheat, and you could significantly increase your thrust. again, there were difference in the amounts of thrust depending on the mark of lightning you're talking about. And the lightnings that I flew were the Lightning Mark 1, short-range lightning, the Lightning Mark 2, which was in Germany, again, similar to the Mark 1, short-range lightning, the Lightning F2A, which was what most of the F2s were converted to F2As. Basically, they were converted to look similar to the Lightning Mark 6 with the big ventral tank on, except that they were long recognised, the Mark 2A, as probably the best lightning of the bunch. And why was that the case? I'll tell you why. Because it had the most fuel for a start. The Mark 6 had the big ventral, but had the guns in the front of the ventral tank, whereas the Mark 2A had integral guns in the fuselage of the aircraft, and so it didn't need all that. The area where the 6 has got the guns was fuel in the F2A. But the other main reason was the fact that the F2A had a much better gun sight than the other aircraft as well, and they were, in my view, a more reliable aircraft because the engines were cooler than the engines that were in the Mark 6 and the Mark 3, and this had quite a few benefits when it came to emergencies. In my view, particularly catching fire, which the Lightning was very prone to do. So that was the engines. The armament of the aircraft was 2 missiles and guns, varying capabilities. We had our navigation was mainly sort of done by TACAN, Tactical Air Navigation System, which we did have sort of what they call an offset capability. So it was quite an efficient system. We could use our TACAN to reliably sort of navigate to various waypoints. Not the same as later aircraft with inertial navigation systems, etc. But as long as it did work all right. And it had a radar. A radar, AI-23, was really sort of fairly basic radar, if I'm quite honest. It was a pulse radar. And we were range, you might see a target at 30 miles, but you were unlikely. And most of the time you would see a target between 20 and 25 miles in the medium levels, and at low level you were lucky if you saw a target sort of outside 5 miles, quite frankly. So from the pilot point of view, you were working pretty hard. Avionics, it had avionics, the avionics of the day, really. We had an instrument landing system. We did have an autopilot, and we had a radio. We had the basic kit. We had standby instruments. We had the main instruments. It was the Lightning, from the instrumentation point of view. In my view, it had quite a well laid out instrumentation in the cockpit, but certainly from a pilot's point of view, I had made it easy to be able to, because we had to always have a good scan as a pilot, to scan the instruments, particularly when you're flying on instruments, because you need to monitor what's going on with your eyes all the time to catch any tendencies that are creeping in. And the Lightning sort of was well set up as far as that's concerned. As I said, it was a big aircraft. Most of the 2 big engines, most of the controls ran down the side of the engines. The fuel lines ran down by the side of the engines. The hydraulic lines ran down by the side of the engines. So you know what I'm coming to now. When you had a leak somewhere, you had a potential problem. And we did. The biggest problem we had with the Lightning when I flew it, and I flew the Lightning for 7 years and did 1,500 hours in it. I can honestly say I enjoyed my last sortie as much as I did my first sortie. It was a dream aircraft. I just absolutely adored flying it. It was a pilot's aircraft. But we did get a lot of emergencies. So we had to be able, because we were moving around the sky so fast, you had to be able to deal with these emergencies, which we did. But the critical one we would get were fires, and because of the control runs, and because of the hydraulics and fuel, as I say, if you get a leak and you get a spark, you have sort of good chance of getting fire. We had fire protection around the engines. We had fire protection in the reheat area as well, but it didn't always stop the fire. So we did actually lose quite a lot of Lightnings through fire. And one of the problems with that in the early stages, the fire would happen, particularly if it was down the back end, and the control runs would burn through. And when the control runs burned through, you would lose control, and and the aircraft would be lost. So they did actually change the control runs to put sort of a stronger control system in, which did make a big difference. And here I am trying to remember exactly what it's made of. I'll think about it in a minute. And it did make a big difference. But our fire drills used to change almost every month, because we get another fire and then people would work out what had happened, and the drill would change again. But basically, in a nutshell, if you got a fire, we used to get spurious fire warnings as well. If you got a fire, the first thing you did was you went up high. Ideally, if you get to 10,000 feet, you go to 10,000 feet. You go up to a place where you could sort of set the aircraft up at, say, 250 knots, and you could just sit there and wait and see. Because the reason why we did that, because it was a spurious fire. If you could still control the aircraft after 5-10 minutes, then it was flyable and you could take it back and land. The reason why we didn't lower it and land straight away, because if it was a fire, it would burn through the controls very quickly. And we lost a couple of pilots by doing just that. They got a fire and they were taking it back to base, and the control runs burnt through literally on final approach, and poof, in they went. And if they'd been able to go up and work it out, because if the aircraft had been on fire, you wouldn't recover it. You were set up in a nice position, you could eject. And if the eject system didn't work, you could still get out by manually sort of ejecting. And even if you had to stand over the side, you could still do that at that height. Whereas, as I said, if you would right down low level, you didn't have time to do anything at all. So that's really what we used to do with the as far as the fire was concerned. We had special sort of flying kit in the Lightning, because we were designed to operate at high levels as well as low levels. So when the Lightning first came in, they used to have a thing called the Taylor helmet, which was all designed to sort of like a spaceman, basically go high and sort of protects you. That caused all sorts of problems as far as lookout was concerned, and it was heavy as well. So eventually we didn't fly with that. We used to fly, when we used to go high, we used to wear pressure jerkins, which were basically sort of jerkins. We'd put them on over our top half, and if we had a decompression at height, then the jerkin would inflate. It would protect us. It would mean that we wouldn't, without that protection, our blood would boil and we'd die very quickly. That did protect us, and we'd also pressure breathe. So when I was posted to the Lightning, the first things I'm talking as well about the aircraft, and talking about the pilot, the route to flying it. We would go to the Aviation Medical Training Centre at RAF North Luffenham, where we'd do a week's course, basically sort of being kitted out with all the relevant flying kit that we needed for the Lightning, which, as I said, was different from most because of the height we were going to operate at. And we would spend a week learning how to pressure breathe. It was something that, if you hadn't been trained in how to pressure breathe, it could cause you problems if you just came to it raw. So we would do that for a week, which was basically sort of designed to sort of kit us out for if we ever had to pressure breathe up at 56,000 feet, which was technically the ceiling of the Lightning. In actual fact, as I said, the engines were so powerful, most Lightning pilots, 56,000 feet was in the flight reference cards was the limit, the height limit, only the height limit, because that is where the test pilots had tested the kit up to. Everybody knew that it would operate above that, and there isn't a Lightning pilot around who hasn't been above 56,000 feet. Many to very high levels. The aircraft was so capable it could do that. So that's what we do. Then we go to onto Coldershall, where we got there, and my course at Coldershall was 6 months. And the very first thing, you go into ground school. I think we did a month of ground school there to learn all about the systems, and also to start learning the checks and the emergencies. Like any aircraft, as pilots, we had to understand the systems, and we had to understand the emergencies. We had to be trained in the emergencies so we could react very quickly. We'd do that, and then before we went flying, we'd go and do sorties in the simulator again to make sure our checks were up to speed and that our handling of emergencies was up. We had to satisfy the authorities that before we went solo, that we could deal with any emergency that was going to come our way. And the trouble about the Lightning was that everything happened. It used to have a lot of emergencies in those days, but everything happened so quickly that when you did get an emergency of some sort, you had to react very quickly. You had to, and so it wasn't sort of sit there, get some aircraft, get the flight reference cards out, have a look at it, and do it in slow time. You didn't have slow time. You just had to know it all. You had to know it all, and you had to do it, because that's the one thing about the Lightning. It was my aircraft. I was in there myself. I was doing absolutely everything, and so you just had to be fast. And we were in an aircraft here that had capability of flying twice the speed of sound, and it really moved around the sky fast. Most of our operations at the levels, the higher levels, we were operating at most of the time just below the speed of sound, and very often we were going supersonic as well. And at the in the lower levels, we'd be flying around probably at 400, 450 knots, and again with the capability of going slower and the capability of rapid acceleration up to 600 plus knots, which is so you were moving around fast all the time. The other thing about the Lightning was the fact that it didn't have much fuel, particularly in those short-range aircraft. You could, an average sortie length was about 40-45 minutes subsonic. If you were going supersonic, the average sortie length was probably about 20-25 minutes. When we got the bigger ventral tank Lightnings, the average sortie length increased to about an hour and a quarter, actually, subsonic, and supersonic to about 45-50 minutes. So it made a big difference. And actually, if you really had to endure for some reason, you could stay airborne in the big range Lightning. You could stay airborne for nearly 2.5 hours in the Mark IIA. So it was a really sort of quantum leap in capability. I've talked about entry training. I will say right from the outset that only the best pilots went to the Lightning. The guys who sort of really came, A, sort of at the top of their courses, and B, showed the sort of, because actually coming top of the course is one thing, but I think most Lightning pilots you meet, you'll see a fairly extrovert characters. That doesn't mean to say we didn't have introverts. There were introverts, but most of them were extroverts. And that is what most fighter pilots are, in fact. So you've got to have a sort of a bit of a character to sort of who flies what aircraft. Where people failed on the Lightning, I mean, was in two areas. One, more often than not, if people were failing because they couldn't keep up with the aircraft, i.e., their mental capacity was just not fast enough to cope. And there was, you couldn't, if you were behind the aircraft, you were in the wrong place. You had to be with it. You had to be in front of it. You had to be anticipating all the time. And coupled to that would be sort of coping under pressure. Well, mental capacity and coping under pressure are very much allied anyway. Those who posted to the aircraft were posted it because they had the ability to fly. It was just the extra speed that and the pace of things that maxed them out. And quite a few people did fail on that. And some people did, left at varying points, funny enough, when they got on squadrons. And most of that, because we were in this big aircraft, big 20-ton aircraft. We were young guys flying ourselves, doing some pretty demanding flying. We were all-weather fighter pilots by day and night. And at night operations on a dirty, dark night can be really challenging. It was really challenging on any aircraft, but you've got to fly the aircraft. People I know sort of, and this is why I know one or two people who did quit because something happened. Sometimes they obviously frightened themselves doing something, and you could, because you've got nobody you haven't got a fighter gator there or anybody warning you that you're getting into a problematic area or telling you to stop doing something because it's getting dangerous. You've got to recognise that yourself, and one or two people did get caught out. Anyway, that's the subject of another thing. So the training itself, well, all I say about the Lightning right from the start is it's just a beautiful aircraft to fly. Beautifully harmonised controls, powerful engines. When I climbed in that cockpit, it just like felt it was like being at home. And actually, in every aircraft I've flown, you talk about flying the aircraft. Actually, I see the climbing in an aircraft like the Lightning is like putting on sort of a glove or something like that. The aircraft and I, like any aircraft flown, we work as a team. You know, it always tells me what it wants me to do, and I tell it what I want it to do as well. So we have little discussions between us, and we do it. And I just loved flying the aircraft, and I actually loved being by myself, doing all the things I was doing in this aircraft. When the sort of things we were doing, we'd do a very quick conversion of the aircraft, which was general handling, including aerobatics. All this was second nature because we'd be coming through aircraft, and it had to be second nature because we were moving on to an operational aircraft now, and the flying of the aircraft had to become second nature. But you've got to prove yourself in handling the aircraft, in formation, in night flying, in instrument flying, everything you've done before, and that you can understand the systems of the aircraft. Most of the emergency training was done in the simulator. We didn't need to do it in the air. We got enough training with actually emergencies. And speed-wise, we would take off, and I'm going to think because I've flown so many aircraft, but the different marks of Lightning that I flew, the short-range Lightnings, we would lift off, I think it was about 160 knots or so, and landing speed was, again, it depended on the fuel weight, but was in the order of, we'd cross the hedge, we called the hedge at the end of the runway, at 165 knots, as I recall, and we just flare, and the wheels would actually touch at about 155, which is still going pretty fast, and it had it's a big, so 20 tons, had a big narrow track, not that wide track undercarriage, but with high pressure tyres, which is another area. We had a chute. We would always pull the chute because most of the runways we operated from was 7,500 feet, and we needed that. And if you had a chute failure, and we used to have chute failures quite a lot, then you would, in all probability, you'd go round and you'd come in for what we call a precautionary landing, and you'd aim to really put the aircraft down on the numbers, get the brakes on, because you needed all that runway to stop, and you probably had pretty hot brakes by the time you got to the end as well. So even a chute failure was problematical. And the tyres themselves, crosswind was an interesting thing. Our crosswind limit was 25 knots on a dry runway. It was 20 knots, as I recall, on a wet runway, and I think it was 15 knots on a flooded runway. But the 25 knot crosswind, well, all three were very real limits because of the tyres, and because of the possibility of wet runways and flooded runways, the possibility of aquaplaning, for example, because you're going so fast. But if we had a 25 knot crosswind, the aircraft would land it fine, no problem. But the trouble was, downwind tyre, the tyre where most of the pressure was on the ground, would be shredded. And in fact, a Lightning tyre rarely used to last more than 5 or 6 landings before it had to be changed. So the tyres were a very interesting area. Now, what haven't I talked about now? So the actual training, so we did conversion training, and then we get into basic radar training when you basically, this is all new, and you're learning all about how to use the radar. You're learning about how to carry out intercepts, a variety of basic intercepts, which is really all about geometry. So it does require, for a single seat pilot up there, you've got to have a good understanding of the mathematics of it all. So a mathematical brain helps a lot. But most importantly, you need a brain that's working fast, because the calculations you're going to do as you're doing your intercept work, when you've only picked up a target at 20 to 25 miles and you're travelling together, you're doing Mach 0.9, he's probably doing Mach 0.9, your closing speed rate is massive, and you've only got a matter of seconds to make a decision. to manoeuvre the aircraft to get into put it into the intercept position, and then get round the back and carry out a successful intercept. At the same time, you're flying the aircraft and you're also operating the radar, which is a multi-faceted, it's a nice thing. I mean, I feel it all the time, but it works. You get used to it. It's like anything, but I just found it just fitted me, and you could do it all beautifully. But that was basic. We learnt all that, and then if people had got through the conversion phase, they would probably get through the basic radar phase. Once you're through the conversion phase, there weren't too many failures. We then got to advanced radar, where we'd learn more sort of complex intercept. We'd learn intercepts. We'd learn about intercepting supersonic targets. We'd learn about intercepting high-flying targets. And when I talk about supersonic, we might be at any speed. The target might be at any speed. And again, the closure rates are fast, and the mental calculations have to be fast as well. If we're going to high level to intercept an aircraft at high level, it's exactly the same thing. You've got the added thing now. You've got to work out what height he's at, and we would do most of the time we would do a boom and zoom sort of intercept technique. We go high speed at 36,000 feet or thereabouts, accelerating to maybe 1.3, maybe 1.6 before we would convert or even faster. We convert our speed to height as we completed the intercept. Actually, against a high-level target, we could actually do a subsonic intercept against a high-level target, but that was required that required very sensitive flying as you got towards the high levels, and it was a lot easier to do the boom and zoom technique. And then there was low-level intercepts. There was always the battle formation to do. You were always working as a pair or more. So you always formation was something, whether it was close formation or battle formation, and you'd use both on every single sortie. Because remember, you'd be in close when you were going through cloud. Actually, you might not. You might be on some situations. You might be actually using your radar to sort of trail another aircraft coming down. There was variety. There was so many different options we could use, but we had to be able to switch just like that in a flash. And then air-to-air combat manoeuvring, air combat, sport of kings as far as I'm concerned. Starting off 1v1, 1v2, 2v1, and then you just get bigger from there, and you get into the similar air combat, that's combat with other aircraft. And so it goes on, but you're still only basic. What we didn't touch at doing the operational conversion unit training were the things we would be doing on the squadrons, which was air-to-air refueling, which again was something that as lightning pilots, as fighter pilots, air-to-air refueling was something we used all the time, and working with airborne early warning. Aircraft like in those days, to start with, was the Shackleton, and used to take them all day to get wherever they were going, or then the Boeing, the Sentry aircraft that with the big dish on the top, which were very capable aircraft. So when we came into the operational theatre, there was a lot more to learn. On the G front, on the Lightning, we could pull up to, I think it was 6.5 G. Again, there were, depending on sort of what you were carrying, your G limits and your speed limits might be have differences. For example, if any aircraft, the aircraft I flew, we never carried what we call the overwing tanks, because that would restrict you to subsonic. They were ferry tanks really. That's restrict you to subsonic and very little G. But most of the Lightnings I flew, I was able most of the time to pull, for most of the time actually, up to 6.5 G. And in certain circumstances we pulled G a lot. Sometimes we didn't. In the circuit, we would, when we were in the circuit, we'd fly, we'd recover to base through what we call a dive arc, because if we were high, we were coming down so quickly. We'd descend at, I think again it was, I think it was 0.9 actually, and then we convert to 350 knots on the way down, and then as soon as we got down to, so we would really sort of, we'd rocket down, and then we'd reduce the speed when we levelled off to initially 300 knots, and then 250 knots, and then our approach speed was probably in the order of, we've got the gear and the flaps down. Our approach speed was probably in the order of 180 knots to start with, which we then taper down to, again, crossing, depending on fuel rate, crossing the hedge, we'd be down at 165 knots, and to touch down at around about 155. Those are in the short range lightning. In the heavier lightnings that we had later on, the bigger ones, then the takeoff speed was faster, and the approach and landing speeds tended to be a bit higher as well. In the circuit, we would fly downwind at 200 knots. We'd turn finals at 170 knots with the gear and flaps down, and again, we'd roll out and touch down. We didn't actually, when we were in the circuit, we didn't touch down. We would always do overshoots until the final landing. We'd only touch down on the final landing. And the reason, which I've covered already, was the tyres, because the tyres just, they don't last. So it was just a way of preserving the tyres, and they cost a fortune too. So I think that covers sort of a little bit about the operations. I'm pretty sure I haven't, things I won't have covered as well. So the Lightning was just a beautiful, beautiful aircraft, and I know now it's over 50 years ago since I was flying the aircraft, and it becomes more and more iconic every year. Lightning pilots are known as WEWOLs, and the reason is that WEWOL stands for When I Was on Lightnings, because it'd be rare to meet a Lightning pilot at a bar without him talking about Lightnings when I was on Lightnings within 5 minutes or so of starting any discussion. So Lightning pilots are known as WEWOLs, and very proud of it too. I just am so pleased that I had the opportunity to fly the Lightning, and it's made such a big and important impact on my life, including meeting my wife. My wife, incidentally, was a very good air traffic controller at Coldershall when I was there. I met her and married her, and then later in her time we came back from America actually, and she couldn't go back into air traffic that big, because she had to leave the RAF when babies came along. In those days it was the way it had to be, and so when our three children sort of grew up, then she went back to work again, but she went and went to university and got a physiotherapy degree. So I say to people, well, I married an air traffic controller, but now I'm married to a physiotherapist. Probably the right time actually, with my knees as knackered as they are. But back to the Lightning. The Lightning was just, it was a dream aircraft. Other places that flew the Lightning, the RAF had 2 squadrons at RAF Lucas. It had 2 squadrons at RAF Binbrook. It had 2 squadrons at RAF Coldershall. It had 2 squadrons at RAF Watersham. Coldershall was the operational conversion unit as well. 2 squadrons at RAF Watersham and Suffolk. There were 2 squadrons at Gütersloh in Germany, which is where I went. There was 1 squadron at Akrotiri in Cyprus, and there was 1 squadron at RAF Tanger in Singapore. And other countries that flew the Lightning, Saudi Arabia operated the Lightning for many years. Kuwait had Lightnings, and that I think is about it, except Lightnings today. Until recently, you won't see any Lightnings flying around the UK, or Europe for that matter, but there have been Lightnings flying in South Africa, at a place called Thunder City, where there were 4 Lightnings operating. One unfortunately was lost in a very unfortunate accident some years ago, but they're actually all on the ground at the moment because they're up for sale, looking for somebody to come buy them. So that's where the Lightning are operated as well. But the Lightning is a very, very special aircraft, and it's people like me. Most of the pilots on the squadron who flew the Lightning were young first officers like me. So the squadrons were great places to be. The camaraderie on a fighter squadron was just, a Lightning squadron was just special. Take 92 Squadron. I was on Goodisloe, very famous squadron, wartime Battle of Britain squadron, one of the top scoring wartime squadrons. Also a squadron that was the RAF aerobatic team, the Blue Diamonds at one stage, and we had 12 aircraft. Actually, normally we had probably an extra one or two, but 12 was our NATO requirement, and we normally had pilots to equip 12 aircraft, which the ratio that was relevant at the time meant that we had a minimum of 15 pilots. So as pilots, we were a real band of brothers. You know, that's one thing about the Lightning and single-seat aircraft. You're all there together, you're working. We worked together every day, we flew together every day. We, day and night, we operated together, we socialized together. We had to trust each other. We had to know each other, we had to trust each other, and we did. And we were a really good bunch, and to this day, particularly on my first squadron, most of them are still alive, and most of them remain very, very good friends. Even just a couple of years ago, I went to Goodisloe, which is the closest station to East Germany, and three of us visited there because it was 50 years since we operated the place, and it was such a nostalgic visit to go back to a place like Goodisloe and to see the battle flight where we used to operate from, with two aircraft at 5 minutes readiness, day and night, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and also to see places like the officers' mess, where we had a famous, what we called a Keller bar, scene of many a sort of a good party, particularly on a Friday night, and also the home of a very famous room called Goering's room, where one of the beams in the ceiling falls in. Well, there's another story. Now's not the time to tell that story. I'd just like to finish by saying I'm a lucky man to have flown the Lightning. It is still my favourite aircraft to this day, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't talk about it, that I don't think about it, I don't dream about it. It is part of me. Thank you very much.